Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot B-Side, where we dig deeper into the stories from our Thursday news and politics chat. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi, ready to flip the record over.
And I'm Kenny, steering the ship from A-side and B-side carefully so we don't drift all the way down to the seaside.
Now, yesterday we looked at what the summer of 2026 might hold, for good or ill.
Today, we plan to get into the weeds on Palantir, that company everyone's heard of but isn't entirely sure what it does.
And our guest is someone who knows all too well. Today, I interviewed award-winning investigative journalist Peter Geoghegan about his latest piece over at the London Review of Books as he shines a light on the murky detail of Peter Thiel and Palantir. Let's have a listen. Quiet Riot. Today, we're digging into one of the most consequential and least understood contracts in British public life, the £330 million deal between Palantir and the NHS. It's a story that touches everything from data privacy and patient trust to the murky world of political lobbying, and it lands at a pivotal moment with Andy Burnham about to walk into Downing Street and inherit a decision that could define his approach to tech, transparency and public services. To help us unpack it, I'm joined by regular Quiet Rioter Peter Geoghegan, who, along with Lucas Amin, have just published a brilliant long read in the London Review of Books on exactly this topic. So, Peter, welcome back to the show. Before we get into the politics of it all, I want to start really simply because I suspect a lot of our listeners have heard the name Palantir without quite knowing what the company actually does and does for that contract it's got with the UK.
Not just listeners, can I say?
And critically as well, who is behind it? So just for anyone coming to all of this fresh, tell us, what does Palantir actually do and who are the key figures running the show?
It's a very good question, Naomi, and I think a lot of people, your listeners are not the only ones. I'll actually put my hand up and say I was probably in that position, not, a while ago, but not all that long ago in the grand sweep of things. I think it's a name that we hear a lot about, and a lot of people are going, what exactly does Palantir do? When we talk about FDPs and data deals, what does all of this mean? So just to strip it back, very, very briefly, potted history of Palantir. It's formed in 2003, and it's formed by two people. A guy called Peter Thiel, who I'm sure listeners have heard of. Peter Thiel's a big Trump supporter, the man who really we've to thank for JD Vance, the person who gave JD Vance his first 10 million to go and run for office, a libertarian. He set up PayPal. He's been in business with Elon Musk. He's a very, very rich individual. And he set up Palantir with his former Stanford roommate, Alex Karp. And politically, Karp is interesting because Karp is a Democrat. He's been a long-term donor to the Democratic Party. He describes himself as a socialist. That's changed. We might talk about that in the course of this. He's now very much in the Trump camp too. But effectively, these two guys set up this company, Palantir. It's after 9/11. That's a big part of the Palantir story. Because what Palantir is saying is, look, there's all this data, and this is in America. They're in Palo Alto. They're in Silicon Valley. They started above a sushi restaurant in Palo Alto. So, very much in the kind of Silicon Valley milieu. And their pitch is basically, there's lots of data out there in the US government. They've got all these different records, but the data doesn't speak to itself. It's on spreadsheets in different places. Some of it's at this stage in the early 2000s still, it's not even digital, it's still analog. And one of the problem for that is if you're trying to prosecute a war on terror, if you're trying to find these potential terrorists, you can't find them, you can't surveil them, you don't know where they are. So what Palantir is selling is that we can do something about this. And this is the crucial bit about Palantir. I think people miss this. I'm going to spell it out early. People listening to Palantir, you would think at times, they talk a lot about AI, you would think that they're like Anthropic or OpenAI who make foundational AI frontier models. Palantir doesn't do that. It doesn't make AI and it doesn't make hardware. It doesn't make bombs. It's not BAE Systems. What Palantir does is produce software. It's a software company. And what they were doing is producing in the early years software that was supposed to try and help the US government initially, their first big investor actually was the CIA's investment arm, helped them to find what they might call bad guys. And so that's the root of this company. It's a software company. And since then, and what my piece tries to unspool is what's happened to the company since then. It now does lots of other stuff. It's in the UK, there's a lot of, there are big plays in the NHS and health tech, but effectively it still is a defense and surveillance company. It's big contracts in the US. It works with ICE, with Trump's ICE enforcement, to try and find illegal immigrants as they return them. It works a lot with the Israeli defense forces and the Israeli military. It's been accused of complicity in war crimes in Gaza, which it denies. But it's still very much a military-focused company, but does other things too. It's got a lot of contracts in the UK. But effectively, what it is selling is software. And the idea is that this software will take this data that's in disparate places, bring it together, and allow people to use it for whatever ends they want.
Can I say something? That is, I don't know if either of you have seen it, but that is exactly the plot of the series Person of Interest. Did either of you know that?
What series is this?
It is exactly the plot of the series Person of Interest by Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother, which is all about a company that kind of post 9/11 takes all the data and synthesizes it into predicting crime.
RoboCop
sorry.
got there first.
Yeah, sorry. That's.
I am googling this. I'm going to put my hands up as we speak.
It is so specifically about that. Sorry, yeah. I just thought I'd put that in brackets.
Yeah,
sorry.
Great, and we'll hoover that up. I want to go back, Peter, to Thiel a bit more. As you said, he bankrolled much of J.D. Vance's career. He's urged Americans to vote for Trump, but also in 2009. He said, and I quote, that he no longer believes that freedom and democracy are compatible. Given that he has said that, why do you think any British government has ever let him near our most beloved institution of the NHS?
I think it's a really, really good question. And the Science and Technology Select Committee that sits in Parliament of backbench MPs is an influential committee. They came out last month and said that the government should basically end this contract with Palantir. And one of the reasons they said was that it's not compatible with British values. And I know that it's become a bit of a culture war issue. If you look at the Times in particular, has got really pro-Palantir. They've got Louis Mosley, who's the head of Palantir UK. He seems to have almost like a rolling column at this stage. The Telegraph's got very pro-Palantir too. So it's turned into a bit of a culture war issue. But I think fundamentally there is a real question there about whether you want people like that involved. And his vision of the future, they have a huge NHS contract. For Thiel, the NHS is what he would class as socialised medicine. He thinks it's a terrible thing. He thinks it shouldn't exist. And so there's a question about, would you hire a company whose founder, who's still very influential? It's not like Thiel and Karp set this thing off and then wandered off. Karp is the CEO. Thiel is still very much involved in Palantir. It's not like he's disappeared. So it's not like some sort of legacy. It's not like you're talking about Henry Ford and what Henry Ford's anti-Semitism versus the Ford company now. This is knitted into the DNA of Palantir. It's a very, very fair question. And I'd go even further, especially after earlier this year in April, I'm sure some listeners would have heard of this. Palantir's Twitter account on a kind of sleepy Sunday in April published this kind of incredible 22-long screed, which was drawn from Alex Karp's book. And effectively, what they were saying was, some cultures are more aggressive. We just need to deal with that. We are here at the bulwark of civilization, talking about AI-fueled drone warfare and saying explicitly that Palantir exists to protect the US state. Well, that's got to have a huge security implication for Britain. There's a national security question. If you've got a company that says its raison d'etre is to protect the American state, and the American state has said that they don't like you very much, which is what they've said numerous times, Vance and Trump, that's also a security challenge because they are saying that is more important to them than their customers. So if there comes a moment where there might be, this isn't impossible to see. We've seen elements of this over the last 18 months where Britain and America's interests massively diverge. Where's Palantir's interest in all this? Well, the company has said they're with the United States. So should we have them playing such a central role? And it's not just in the health service. They have probably about £1 billion worth of government contracts, if not more, in defence, in lots of other areas as well, the Financial Conduct Authority, even just recently the National Firearms Database, which isn't a huge contract, it's £9 million, but every privately held firearm, that data now sits with Palantir.
I feel this is a story about good Peters, you, and bad Peters, because while Peter Thiel has spent years building relationships with the British right, and you've talked about how much the Telegraph and the Times eulogise about Palantir, but also now via Peter Mandelson, they've built relationships with Labour as well. So I wanted to ask you whether you think Palantir's UK success is really a story about having this superior technology that can aggregate data from multiple sources and allow state functions to make more informed decisions, or whether this is about Thiel's operation and lobbying operation effectively, just being better at capturing whoever is in power, regardless of the shade of that party.
This is one of the reasons I wanted to kind of look at Palantir's story, to be honest, because, like, at Democracy for Sale, a big part of the thing I've been doing for years is looking at this power and influence and access. And I was really struck that, like, there's been a lot of heat about Palantir. A lot of people talk about it, as you say. I felt like there wasn't enough light. And so I came into this with two questions, and one of which I think we'll probably get onto, which is, how does this software work, or does it work? But the second one, which was the first one in some respects, was, how did Palantir get so much access? And I went back, I actually reread a book called The Contrarian by Max Chafin that came out about 5 years ago. It's a biography of Peter Thiel. And I'd actually reviewed it when it came out, so I was familiar with it. I went back and read it again because I kind of wanted to understand a bit more of the genesis of Palantir. And it was quite useful to read a book that was 5 years old because Palantir's had so much heat over the last few years that I think a book now, that would be the focus. I wanted to understand where the company had started and what its kind of raison d'etre was. And it's really interesting because Palantir sets up, the first thing Palantir does is start hiring really well-connected Washington insiders when it starts up in America. It hires people like John Poindexter, James Carville, even General Mike Flynn, the kind of disgraced Trumpist general. Palantir understands, and the reason I'm saying this is Palantir understood the value of political access. When it basically rocks up in Britain around 10 years ago, at which stage it's actually in real trouble in the States. The business is going south in the States and it needs to move, and Chafin talks about it. It needs to go to other places where its name isn't known and its failures aren't known. So it comes to Britain. And what it does in Britain, I think, is a very canny move. It hires Global Counsel to be its lobbying.
Peter Mandelson's outfit.
Peter Mandelson's firm. And in fact, when Palantir gets hired by Global Counsel has been set up by Mandelson just as he left government. And we know now a lot from the Epstein emails about the roots of Global Counsel. Epstein was very involved. If you look at the emails, you can see that Epstein's secretary was even printing off pitch decks for Global Counsel back when it started. Mandelson was asking Epstein for advice. So Global Counsel starts, it's based in London, and Palantir becomes one of their biggest clients, if not their biggest client. And Global Counsel went into administration earlier this year, and I did reach out to talk to them for this story, the administration. I never heard back from them. But I was able to talk to a lot of people who did work at Global Counsel, partly because it's no longer there. It's easier to talk to people. And what was striking is I was able to ascertain that Global Counsel was one of their biggest clients. They had a retainer of more than £30,000 a month with Palantir. The contract was so secret, it had a code name inside Global Counsel called Project Onion, so people didn't want to know about it. But what was key was Mandelson was very interested in Palantir. Some clients Mandelson just wasn't that interested in. He might go and do a deal with them, but then he'd kind of walk away. Like Global Counsel was effectively selling Mandelson's connections. But for some clients, he wasn't as interested. Palantir he was interested in. And what I tried to try and build up a picture of in this piece was how Global Counsel was able to help Palantir, and how our really bad rules allowed this to happen. So what's striking is Palantir hires Global Counsel. This isn't published anywhere. They hired him in 2018. Nobody knows about this because there's no transparency on lobbying.
But you know about it because you've peeled back the layers of Project Onion.
Exactly. Basically, that's effectively what I wanted to do. And what's striking is Global Counsel was able to get Palantir meetings with senior politicians, senior policymakers. And what they do things like put on an event, say like health tech, how to revolutionize the NHS with tech. They'd invite all these people. They'd invite senior people from Palantir. Senior people from Palantir would meet ministers, meet senior civil servants. They'd be able to swap numbers possibly. They'd be able to talk to each other. They would certainly email afterwards. But none of that was recorded on transparency registers because doesn't count as direct lobbying in the UK. So this was going on, and Palantir was able to really start to build connections. And they became very, what you can see is once Global Council starts working for Palantir, the contracts start to roll in. They start to get more and more contracts. And the key one is this NHS contract, this £330 million federated data platform. And I spoke to somebody, a guy called Shane Tickell, who bid for that contract. A rival consortium that didn't get it. And he talked about how Palantir, nothing was illegal, but Palantir had the influence. And the key thing, what Global Council was able to help Palantir do, and this is something that happens across the piece, rarely in the UK are contracts awarded fraudulently. You don't give someone a contract. You don't rig the process of giving the contract. You don't say, give it to my friend.
You do in the PPE scandal during lockdown.
Yes, you do in the PPE scandal. Well, there was no contracts in the PPE scandal. There was no tendering process. That was part of the problem. So you're able to just make direct awards. But if you tender a contract, which you're supposed to do, what the big thing to do is influence the process of writing that tender. And that's why I think Global Council were very effective. They were able to write the tender for this big NHS document in ways, and I'm not the only person who's reported on this, the FT has done good reporting on this too, that really meant that by the time the tender comes out, it's really clear there's only one company that's going to be able to get that, and that one company is Palantir.
Quiet Riot. Starting or growing your own business can be intimidating and lonely at times. Your to-do list may feel endless with new tasks, and lists can easily begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything as a built-in business partner can be a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Gymshark, Rare Beauty, and Heinz, to brands just getting started. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that can help you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. And you can tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. And if people haven't heard about your brand, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. That's shopify.com/realm. Quiet Riot.
So the contract runs up to £330 million, as far as we know at the moment. But MPs have pointed out that the NHS ends up owning no intellectual property, no software, and absolutely no lasting capability once that subscription ends. So, Peter, if Palantir left tomorrow for whatever reason, what would the NHS tangibly have to show for this enormous amount of money already sunk?
It's a really good question, and we spoke to lots of analysts, mainly off the record, but we have some people on the record in the piece too who say this, and it's what we call vendor lock-in. Because Palantir's software is proprietary software, so that means that they own it and the NHS licensed it from Palantir. So it means that rather than being able to edit it themselves, NHS data analysts have to ask Palantir to do stuff. And that creates a problem too, because Palantir can be very slow to do stuff sometimes. So it can create a real bottleneck. So there's a kind of a practical problem as currently stands. But also the big issue that they all flag, or made them flag, is that what happens afterwards? Because this work has been done on this, it's called Foundry. So this thing called a federated data platform, which pulls in data from hospitals, from pharmacies, from various different places. That runs on Palantir's Foundry platform. So what happens when you take Foundry away? Well, this is the big question. NHS England have been very, very weak in explaining what would happen afterwards. From talking to the experts, they basically all say the same thing, that actually almost all of the work that they've done would be wasted. NHS England have been constantly, furiously citing various statistics to talk about how successful the FDP has been. We've been for a good while actually publishing alternative facts, different statistics, basically drilling into the NHS's own statistics that show that, for example, when they say that almost 2/3 of trusts are now using the FDP, actually a lot of them haven't logged on to any of its apps in the last 12 months. So That's all. There's a lot there that really contests what the NHS England
And
is.
we've all worked in companies where they rolled out some new piece of software and there's been an all-staff meeting about how we've got to use it, and then nobody does, and it just kind of sits on the intranet unused. I mean, we've all been there.
And that's what I think is fast. In some ways, that's what I think is really interesting about the story we've been working on. Is it's in some ways it's quite a familiar story too. That's what happened. There's a fascinating scene in the piece from about 2 years ago where there's a big meeting of NHS data analysts and some NHS England leaders to talk about the FDP. And it's only started to launch about 2 months earlier, but there's some problems with the rollout. And two things are really striking about it. One is this meeting doesn't happen at NHS England. It happens at Palantir's headquarters in Soho Square in London, which, by the way, to go into a meeting, and we discovered you have to sign an NDA. So that's kind of unusual, that to go to a meeting to discuss your work, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But secondly, what you have is exactly that. You have people there saying, data analysts, this looks terrible. I can't work it. It doesn't look any good. It's not doing what I want it to do. And effectively, I think a large part of the story of the last 2 years has been the politicians, political leaders, NHS leaders furiously trying to push this through, even actually handing out contracts. KPMG have a contract for almost £9 million that is just to try and promote NHS Trust to use the FDP. And yet, they still aren't.
So you've got KPMG acting as a PR agency for Palantir within the NHS?
Yeah, effectively, yes. Yeah.
Can I ask something, Peter? Does that point to a piece of software that's not very good in a company that's effectively very good at the pitch and capturing basically a contract and keeping it going, but not very good at the actual product? Or does it point to a company that just needs its product to sit there and collect data? Because that's what it's there for. It's not there to help the NHS. It's there to collect data for Palantir. Because those are two very different versions of what's going on.
It's a really interesting question, Alex. And I think this cuts to the heart of the question about Palantir. My argument is, could it be both? Very possibly. What we've been investigating in this piece was how this works and the problems with it, and exactly that. And the question of, was this the right decision, and is this still the right decision now based on what people are saying now, and why are the kind of people we're talking to effectively been silenced and not been listened to? So that was a big part of what we were doing. But if you look at, just last month, the health minister, Peter Geoghegan, had to apologise because it turned out that a couple of hundred Palantir staff had access to all NHS health data. And this goes back, I think, to that question of national security. This is not a normal company. This is not. I've heard Palantir described as evil Salesforce. Salesforce being the big US company that sells tech that people don't use.
It's not totally uneval.
No, yeah, exactly. Eviler Salesforce. The thing with Palantir is it's also quite clearly has a political project at its heart. Its owners are its founders and the people who own huge shares in it talk explicitly about a political process and a project that does involve harvesting a lot of data.
And I come up against this in many areas of public policy, but I find that governments of the day never really think about the decisions they're making today that might actually be under the control of a much more nefarious government in, a few years' time. And so if you can imagine a situation where, God forbid, Reform and the Conservatives win the next election, but with Reform as the largest party, who have, Farish himself has many times talked about the need to fundamentally change the NHS and has talked about insurance-based systems, etc. What you've then got is a party in power and an aligned ideologically private company in Palantir with private medical records of the entire population, which any insurance company would absolutely love to get their hands on and charge enormous premium. So, do you get a sense from within the current Labour government that they have any recognition that what they are helping to build could help at some point in the future a very different shade of government have a very Orwellian impact on our health system.
I don't, if I'm being honest. And it's something I read across a lot of things. I write about money and politics a lot. I similarly don't see still the current government realising the extent of the potential problems coming down the track. Similarly, with all these various regulatory frameworks we have that often are weak, but lack clear footing and could be literally pushed aside. Take the Standards Commission. You could just get rid of that in a heartbeat if you control the executive. So no, I actually don't. I think it's a really important question because if you listen to what Palantir say, and some like Louis Mosley gave evidence to the COVID inquiry, the line from Palantir often is the problem is we don't have enough data.
Well, just like every defense secretary will say, the problem is we don't have enough tanks and guns, and I want more of that. This is a very vested interest. Of course, they say that we need more data. We need more data.
And if they had a government that was really, frankly, who not only has, from a healthcare perspective, having talked about insurance, etc., but also generally, Reform are incredibly friendly to US tech interests. Do we really think that they would do anything against US tech interests? I think that's one area where they've been, that is not something that they've any issue with. What stops Palantir at the moment is our data protection laws. They could be overturned very easily.
The laws hasn't. I mean, if Peter Thiel has had to apologise, the law clearly hasn't stopped them having, and be it cock up rather than conspiracy, access to data. Like, that has already happened. The law didn't stop them. It's just meant that there is some mechanism for resolution when those mistakes inevitably happen.
The law at least provides some sort of guardrails and something you can say something's gone wrong and you've done something wrong and someone has to apologise and something should be done and we should look at it. If you weakened, or if you kind of made our basically just threw our data protection laws into the sea, then it's kind of open season. Like, then you really could do whatever you wanted.
Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot.
Okay, well, let's be a bit more optimistic. Long question here. Is there a credible UK or European alternative to Palantir that could genuinely step in at scale for the NHS contract, the MOD contract, the other contracts that you've mentioned? Or are we now captured by a single supplier hostage situation? And then the second bit that makes this a really long question, there is a break clause in the contract, which comes up quite soon, actually, February 2027. What would it cost in money, in disruption, in lost clinical time to rip Palantir out and rebuild with an alternative company if one exists?
I think it's a really good question. I think in answering it, there's a kind of I'll start by saying I'm not a data scientist and a data expert. So this is basically this is the testimony of people I've spoken to and kind of other views are out there. I think in some ways, the lack of conversation about what could replace this has been part of the wider problem. I think there's been, Palantir is not the first unsuccessful NHS data project, not by a long way. We have spent huge amounts of money over the years on various attempted IT solutions that that have not gone well and have cost us billions and billions and billions. Tony Blair had his national program for information technology, which had a total budget of 12.4 billion, and the Public Accounts Committee subsequently called it one of the worst and most expensive contracting fiascos in the history of the public sector. So we have been here. And I think a bit like what happened then is that there's been a failure of what are the other options. And if you talk to data science people, they would explain to you, and I find this quite compelling, actually. One of the big problems with Palantir software is the Foundry platform is proprietary and it's very one-size-fits-all. It's not particularly well developed for what the NHS needs. What it does is it sucks all this data into this one centralized platform, Foundry. That's the idea. Suck up all this data from different places. But the problem with health data is it's actually often quite messy. It's often quite qualitative. The bits of data held in different places are often different bits of data. They don't necessarily speak to each other at all. The information is about very different types of things. In trying to centralize that, you end up trying to put lots of square pegs into round holes. And they will talk to you about the alternatives, which are more often open source, which means that they're editable, they can be changed, they can be adapted, they can suit different places differently. Because actually the reality is, in a country the size of the UK, you will have the needs for different solutions tech-wise in different places.
And is it an NHS England contract, or is Scotland and Northern Ireland using
It's
it as
NHS
well?
England, so no, Palantir does an operation in Scotland or Northern Ireland. And often what's happened, in a funny way, because of the failure of Blair's program, what happened then was individual trusts started developing their own solutions. So they started developing their own technology and their own data solutions for different places. The FDP has actually been quite successful with the most kind of laggardly trusts. So the hospitals that had the least data capabilities, Palantir Foundry coming along actually is quite useful. Finally, we've got something that we can actually use a bit. We can plug in and play. It might be a bit slow, it might be a bit clunky, but it kind of works. For the trusts and the hospitals that have had the best systems, who've done the best job of knitting up this data in a bespoke way, Palantir, I think, is often seen as a step backwards. It works less. It doesn't give the functionality it had. Because you've taken such a centralized approach, it's very much, I think in some ways, the Palantir story is very much this, it kind of does mirror, I didn't write this in the piece, but now I'm talking, it mirrors slightly Andy Burnham's critique of the British state, a very centralizing, one-size-fits-all, top-down version. That is kind of what's happened here. What Palantir has done is sat on top of what was quite a devolved, albeit in different ways, in different places, and less and more successful in different places, approach to data management and health. Palantir has come and sat on top of it. And the centralization which in theory you might think would develop actually this really innovative product that could knit everything together seamlessly, has often actually had unintended consequences and hasn't really worked as well. So, which brings you to the question of what could you do? What are other places doing? There are other models. Estonia has developed its own program which kind of allows secure data exchange across the public and the private sector. Estonia really is a kind of leading world powerhouse when it comes to digital technology. Finland, Germany, and other places have also been using open source and free to use health data systems as well. Brazil does. Actually, quite strikingly, what we write in the piece is back in 2022, Palantir got a contract to work on homes for Ukraine. So basically to resettle refugees from Ukraine. And it was a very classic Palantir contract, very similar to the NHS contract, actually. Like the NHS contract, Palantir came in and offered to do the work for free initially. And they did that the same with the NHS. And then they got 2 contracts worth about £10 million in total. And subsequently, what happened with that Homes for Ukraine contract, basically the IT system just wasn't very good. The National Audit Office actually did a report on it and found that it wasn't value for money. And subsequently, actually, ironically, earlier this year, the Ministry of Housing put out a press release saying how they are saving millions by no longer using Palantir and using their own systems, which were found to be easier to use as well. So in some ways, like there's bits of government not talking to each other here as well. So there's a problem with that too. So there's been a kind of a failure of imagination, I think, too. And in some ways, even if you thought Palantir and the FDP was great, the fact that we're so locked into US technology, and the world has changed a lot since this contract came out. It really has. And even the UK government, the Labour government, which in 2024 came in being, I think, very pro-Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel, Tony Blair is in the background. We now have Liz Kendall coming out saying we need to talk about tech sovereignty. We set up a fund for UK tech sovereignty. I think there's a big question about Palantir, like a national security question, that even if you think it should stay doing what it's doing, it surely requires a lot more than is currently there.
You've reported on Burnham's refusal to touch Palantir in the 9 years running Manchester. He is now about to inherit this live contract of 330 million and a system half of NHS trusts are currently using to some degree or not. How would you advise him to navigate that?
It's a big question, I think, for him. I wrote a piece in The Guardian based on the LRB piece that kind of says that this is one of the big questions facing him. I think it is, because he's inheriting he is in some ways inheriting the Prime Ministership, and he's inheriting this contract at a very, very key time. Because I mentioned the Health and Technology Select Committee, the Science and Technology Select Committee. The Health Select Committee has also now come out and said that they should exercise this break with the Palantir contract. So you've got a lot of MPs, including a lot of backbench Labour MPs, who want to get rid of, who think that he needs to do this. And I think there's a big question. I think who he puts in as a health secretary, I think it also, you'd imagine this will influence who becomes the health secretary, because I think Wells Streeting was seen as very friendly towards the kind of Palantir view of the world, the kind of centralization view of the world, and the American big tech and the data and the kind of AI play side of it. And I think it'll be very, very striking who he puts into post. And I think that will tell a lot about what's likely to happen with this contract. But I also think that if we're going to get rid of it, there is a real need to kind of move on at speed and going, okay, what are the alternatives to this?
And there's not long to do that if you're going to break it in 2027.
Yeah, there's not a huge, exactly that. I think there's a kind of, there's been a kicking the can down the road aspect to this for a very long time. I'm going to be fascinated to see what Burnham does on this. I think he has the political capital to do it.
Presumably you could turn to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales and say, what are you guys doing?
Yeah, there's a big element of that, like what's gone on. And in some ways, what they've done is closer to what's happened in existing NHS trusts who don't use Palantir. Like, I would say at least half of NHS trusts, if not more, really don't use the FDP based on the data we've seen.
Fascinating.
So there's a lot of people who are not using this. And we're quite a bit away. We're quite a long time into this now as well. So there's plenty going on out there that doesn't use Palantir's FDP, which begs the question about, the other question about why we're using it too. Is this working for us? But also, what are the alternatives?
Palantir really is, though, just the latest and highest profile example of something much older, right? Councils outsourcing everything from bin collection, the privatization of many of our prisons and probation processes. We've got academy trusts that run schools rather than local authorities. And each time the pitch is efficiency and expertise, the taxpayer will get better value for money, but the result is so often less democratic control, and also an erosion of skill and knowledge and understanding within the public body commissioning that outsourced client. And so with that, the ability to scrutinize what your client is telling you they're going to deliver, whether the contract is fulfilling its obligations or not. It's like this hollowing out of knowledge and expertise within a local authority, within a school, within NHS England, whatever it is. So my final question to you, Peter, is whether Palantir is a new kind of problem or just the latest and most visible version of a decades-long habit of outsourcing capability that the state used to hold in-house. And if that's the case, why does this one feel quite so different?
I think there's a really, people talk about the Serco state, Serco being one of these, an outsourcer who just provides, just kind of almost every single job under the sun.
G4S,
G4S, yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many of them. Capita, which is quite nice name for Capita. I forgot that it was called Capita. There's a couple of big, I think, issues with this. And I think, again, actually, this speaks to what Andy Burnham's going to do. He's talked, I think, about, because without getting too boring on it, councils and public procurement works under a thing called best value. And the idea is basically, which effectively is the cheapest. Whoever's the cheapest, you go with. You go with the cheapest bid. And so often what these massive outsourcers are able to develop is they're able to influence tendering processes, as we discussed. So the contract it's kind of written for them. But also they're able to do things cheaper than others because they're very big. And so cheaper in terms of unit price, not overall price is what I mean. Like the kind of like a school meal, we're going to do it for this ridiculously small fee. Often we end up paying above that anyway. So that's a huge thing. I think Andy Burnham has talked a bit about this idea of social value, about contracting with social value. I think that's a really interesting concept. I don't know if will it actually become something? Will it be operationalized as something? But I think like a lot of people I think would have I think this would be cross-party too. This idea that like public procurement shouldn't just be about like the very bottom line, the best value, because sometimes the best value is realized by thinking about, well, how is this going to actually operate in the world?
It's essentially knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
Completely. And connected to that, which I think is an important part of the story often, a particularly important part of the Palantir story, is that we see very senior civil servants, and the MOD is the worst for this, but it's not the only one. We see very senior civil servants leaving jobs in procurement, often are very close to ministers.
Revolving
door, taking up posts either with a company like Palantir directly. So Palantir's hired a lot of staff from NHS Digital. Like, it's quite remarkable.
just to say, as a former civil servant, the notion that people leave the civil service and then set up consultancies or go and work for a big provider is certainly not new. It's something that was going on really full pelt in the 90s and 2000s when I was in the civil service. But the idea that best value contracts are the lowest price, that is a perversion of what the best value framework was meant to provide, because I was there at the start of the best value framework, and it was never just about price. It was about a lot more than price. For instance, it was about intellectual property. Did you end up owning the product of the company you hired or not? You were allowed to take that into account. You were allowed to take into account whether the company you were hiring had produced good results for you when you'd used them before and things like that. So it definitely wasn't just get 3 quotes and go for the cheapest. It was about a much more thorough process than that. And it's been really subverted into saying cheapest gets the contract.
But also they go and work for companies like Global Counsel. They work for lobbying firms. So they are then the people who were previously making the decisions. This is the story of Ofwat. The water companies and Ofwat is a classic case of this. Thames Water and others, their boards are stuffed with former people from the regulator. So when the regulator goes to meet the water companies, the people they're talking to are the people they worked with previously. And this
Mapping
has
all their own homework.
completely. An academic whose name escapes me now has talked about cognitive capture. This idea that the limits of what's possible becomes very, very narrow, because you have a lot of people who both are drawn from the same class in terms of social class, might have been to the same schools and universities, but literally have worked together for years too, making decisions. So I think it's a root and branch issue. The COVID contracting is a great example of that too, where you just go with, oh, I know Jimmy, I know Michelle Moan, she makes underwear, so we're going to give her a couple of £100 million contracts to deliver PPE. It sounds mad when we say it, but there's a kind of cognitive capture in which that makes sense.
Well, listeners, we are going to leave links to Peter's work in the show notes, as well as to his Substack, Democracy for Sale. So go and check those out. And all that's left is for me to say, Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Quiet Riot B-Side.
Thank you so much for having me, Naomi.
Thanks, Peter.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, always better informed at the end of these chats than at the beginning. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, guys.
Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot.
So, guys, now you've heard the warts and all about Palantir from Peter, what's your gut telling you about it all? And, do you think Burnham will or even could strip them of their contract with the UK government?
Or should, indeed. I think Palantir has become a kind of lightning rod for all our anxieties around this area, but I'm not sure that any company with the size and clout and experience to be able to carry out tasks at that scale, like manage all the NHS's data, for instance. I'm not sure there is a company out there that's that big that's not going to have every finger in some pretty unsavory pies. And so that's what worries me. What worries me is that we get into a situation where Palantir becomes this sort of totemic company that we're all against, but we don't know if there are alternatives, which are the alternatives, and whether the alternatives are any better. And I suspect that actually points to what the solution should be. The solution should be that no one company is given too much power, that government retains some expertise in-house so that it is able to check what those companies are doing, which, as you know, is a perennial issue that I've brought up on this podcast again and again, that part of the problem is that government has shed all its experts in these sorts of areas, and so it doesn't know whether its contractors are lying to it or not. It has no capacity to check independently on them to do some quality control. The third thing is a much more is a bigger and more structural issue, which is that at some point we need to talk about, look at, and put the brakes on this insane global consolidation that's going on, where companies are constantly swallowing up each other so that we always end up with like 2 or 3 massive global alternatives in any area you look at. Because what that's resulted in, the idea was that this was going to bring efficiency, but what it's brought actually is those companies having outsized power with
Becoming
relation
too
to the
big to fail.
governments. Exactly, with
Yeah,
relation to the governments
Exactly.
that
We've been
use
there
them.
before. Yeah.
Like if you go into a negotiation with Palantir and you are the UK government, you're not the big player in that negotiation. Palantir is a big player.
That's right.
in that
And
negotiation.
gone are the
And
days
that
where
should never happen, right?
Exactly. And, gone are the days, it feels, where in order to win a government contract, you had to prove your responsibility as an employer. And yet
Yeah.
now we have an employer making their staff write NDAs. And, that surely isn't what a Labour government, of all things, should want to be giving money to, let alone endorsing. Kenny, what's your take on it all?
I've got a real, I don't know, a very bad feeling about it. Not because it's Palantir, but because of what happens when tech companies create services and make the service something that you all of a sudden one day wake up and realize you must have, whether that's social media or whether it's what Palantir would do with the NHS. I think I'm looking at it and going, are we going to wake up one day as a country and discover that Palantir or some other tech giant are offering sovereignty as a service? We've given them so much access, not to the sort of traditional outsourcing stuff. We're not talking about bins or the probation service. We're talking about the knowledge layer of government. We're talking about the knowledge layer of what keeps democracy functioning in this country. And I have seen nothing in the sort of 25 years since the internet really started to change the way that we live our lives that suggests that we can or should indeed trust companies like Palantir not to make it essential and then to have us staring down the barrel of sovereignty as a service.
It's yet another issue where one must look back to Brexit and say that, if we were actually a collection of nations controlling a really powerful purse, we could set our terms when we're negotiating for services from companies like that. But the more you fragment, the more you make yourself a smaller purchaser, the less you have that ability.
Listeners, you must go and read the full piece by Peter and Lucas over at the London Review of Books. We'll leave a link in the show notes. And do sign up to Peter's Democracy for Sale Substack. It's a beaut.
Quiet Riot.
And now it's time to turn severity into levity, turn sour into flour. It's time for Grin and Share It.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Oxford Dictionary of Rhyming Stuff.
It just came to me.
Oh, you're a genius.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. Do-de-o-do-lo, I want good news.
What have you got for us today, Kenny?
All right, well, this week's Grin and Share It begins with a Surrey dog trainer, her black rap Labrador, who's called Tokyo. And
we love doggo stories, don't we?
We do love doggo stories. And an attempt to reach the top of Britain's highest mountain, Ben Everest, which is just outside my front door. The trainer's name is Christina Bloom, and she was hiking up Ben Everest a few days ago with Tokyo. Tokyo is a fit and active working dog, and she appeared to be well on her way to becoming the highest dog in Britain. But during the trudge up the mountain, about halfway to becoming the highest dog in Britain, Tokyo began staggering. She lost the use of her legs, and she started drifting in and out of consciousness. With no way to carry a 25-kilogram Labrador safely back down, Christina called for help, and volunteers from the Lochaber Mountain Rescue Team, who are all too familiar with human emergencies on Ben Everest, well, they were just as happy to help a canine casualty. They put Tokyo on a stretcher,
Butler.
and they carried her
I think
down
they
the
were
mountain.
more happy to help a Labrador.
They carried her all the way down the mountain to Crown Vets in Fort William, my hometown. Now, thankfully, Tokyo made a full recovery the following day.
Oh.
But there's a little bit of a twist to this happy ending, because the vets wanted to know why a fit, healthy working dog would suddenly fall so ill on a hillside. They now believe that Tokyo had eaten cannabis that someone had discarded beside the mountain path. So Tokyo did, in fact,
she
become the
was the
highest dog
highest.
in Britain. Yes, just not the way that they planned. So it's a happy ending and a high ending for Tokyo,
brilliant.
and a gentle
Amazing.
reminder to take your weed home with you when your litter is capable of getting a Labrador completely
that's
off her.
brilliant.
They really
That
will
is
eat anything. They'll
Oh,
eat
they
anything.
will.
Can you
That's
imagine the
brilliant.
munchies a high Labrador will have got like that? Those dogs can eat, but one with chronic munchies. Oh, God.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Kenny.
Listeners will drop a link in the show notes as ever, so you too can grin, share it, and get high on our happiness.
I was meant to read that.
And that brings today's B-side to a chaotic close. Huge thanks to everyone who joined us. Before you go, please grab your tickets for our live show on the 30th of July at the Leicester Square Theatre, where we'll be joined by the Lincoln Project and by Byline Times. It promises to be a very special night, and we would genuinely love to see you there. The link, of course, will be in the show notes.
And if you're one of our wonderful backers at ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, keep an eye out for details of a backers-only meetup at a pub near the theatre after the show. One more reason to join the Quiet Riot family, don't you think, if you needed it?
And we'll be back on Sunday to pick through the week's political wreckage at a gentler pace. We love you all very, very much.
Bye.
Quiet Riot.
Quiet Riot is an audio production from Cooler Heads, written and produced by Alexandrou, Naomi Smith, and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese.
Quiet Riot.